The discovery began with a mistake. In a county archive where no one ever hurried, a clerk pulled the wrong box from the shelf and dropped it on the table with a hollow thud. Inside were not the routine tax rolls and marriage licenses he expected, but a slim, leather-bound ledger that did not belong there at all. The ink on its spine had almost faded to nothing, yet 3 words were still legible if you tilted it into the light. Special Register, reclassified. On the first page, in precise 19th century handwriting, a single sentence explained what that meant. Here follow those Negroes whose status has, by law or discretion, been corrected to white. Most lists from the age of slavery are brutally simple. They count people the way a shipping manifest counts cargo: name, age, sex, price. Sometimes even the names are denied, replaced by a single line that reads, boy, girl, woman, man. These documents were never meant to tell stories. They were meant to prevent them. This ledger was different. The first entries looked almost ordinary: dates, names, places. But then came a column no ordinary slave inventory carried: previous status. Next to it, in careful ink, appeared words that should have contradicted the faces the law assumed: colored, Negro, mulatto, free woman of color. The column after that, even more unsettling, read, new status. And there, over and over, the clerk had written the same word: white. No explanation, no justification. Just a date, a name, and an official decision that turned one legal body into another. It was as if the book recorded small acts of magic performed with a pen, people stepping through paper into a different category of existence. You could trace it with your finger. On one line, a woman marked as quadroon in an earlier deed reappeared as white after marriage to a merchant. On another, a child born to an enslaved mother was listed as colored in a plantation record, then struck through and re-entered as white in this special register. The note in the margin saying only, for purposes of inheritance. The ledger did not explain how these transformations were negotiated, what money changed hands, which secrets were traded, whose shame or greed made the ink flow. It simply assumed that such transactions belonged to the same universe as land transfers and property disputes. To the person who kept this record, changing a human being's race had become an administrative task, a city built on categories. To understand why such a ledger could exist at all, you have to step back into the world that produced it. In the 19th century American South, especially in port cities like New Orleans, Charleston, and Norfolk, race was not just a social fact. It was infrastructure. It determined where you could walk, what you could buy, whom you could marry, where you could be buried. Lawmakers did not talk about race as a feeling. They talked about it as a system of permissions and prohibitions. The categories themselves were unstable, yet harshly enforced. A person might be labeled Negro, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, free person of color, Creole, or simply white, depending on local custom and the needs of the moment. The vocabulary varied, but the logic was consistent. Anything that could tie you to African ancestry, even rumor, even resemblance, could be used to push you down the hierarchy. For enslaved people, that hierarchy was absolute. They were property in the eyes of the law, with no recognized legal family, no legally protected body, no right to consent. For free people of color, the situation was more complicated. In some cities, they built communities, owned businesses, even held property, and hired white workers. but they lived under constant threat that the rules could tighten overnight. A riot, a new law, a war scare, any of these could redraw the border between tolerated and criminal. Above them all, sitting on the high branches of this constructed tree, were those defined as white. Whiteness meant more than skin tone. It meant the right to be presumed human before anything else. Yet the sea did not care about these categories, and neither did desire. Ships brought in people from Africa, from Europe, from the Caribbean, from the interior of the continent. Men who called themselves white-fathered children, with women the law called black. Those children grew up under roofs that belonged to the fathers' families, in kitchens, in yards, in cramped cabins behind the main house. Some were acknowledged privately, some not at all. But they all existed, and their existence made the clean lines of the racial system wobble. When those children had children of their own, especially when one generation after another kept pairing with lighter-skinned partners, biology began to do something the law had not planned for. The skin of the next generation might be so pale that a stranger could not tell by looking which side of the line they belonged to. That was the moment when paperwork became a weapon. The ledger from the archive did not record conversations, but you can reconstruct their outlines. Picture a sugar planter whose white daughter has fallen in love with a man of ambiguous background, perhaps a clerk from town, perhaps a craftsman with good prospects. His skin is nearly white, his hair straight, his manners polished. There are whispers, of course, about his grandmother, but no one can say for certain, and the man's work and piety are above reproach. The father could forbid the marriage. He could insist on proof of pure ancestry that no one, not even his own family, could truly provide. Or he could do something else. Lean on a friendly clerk, an accommodating priest, a lawyer who knows how to phrase things, and have the man's status formally clarified as white. A baptismal record amended. A birth notice rewritten. A line in a parish book that once read of mixed blood crossed out and replaced with something safer. For the couple, the change is salvation. It opens doors that would otherwise slam shut. Their children can inherit without challenge, marry without scandal, live without fear of being shoved into a train car marked colored. The cost is not measured only in money. It is measured in silence. Whatever black ancestry existed must never be spoken of again. In another case, the pressure comes not from love but from greed. An elderly white bachelor dies without direct heirs, leaving behind land and money. A rumor spreads that somewhere in the city lives a woman who is his daughter by an enslaved or free black woman, light-skinned enough to be mistaken for white. If she can be located and her status corrected, she might inherit. Or she might be used as a pawn in a larger family power struggle. Here, too, papers can be drawn. A judge can be persuaded that the woman is white for all practical purposes, that recognizing her as such will stabilize property, keep estates intact, prevent scandal. The fact that the same judge might, on another day, declare a different person Negro on flimsier evidence does not trouble the record. Consistency was never the point. Control was. These negotiations did not happen every day, and they did not happen for everyone. They were privileges extended selectively, usually to those who already had proximity to power. Light skin, useful connections, skills that made them valuable. For the vast majority of people with African ancestry, The system only ever moved in one direction, downwards. But the ledger shows that the system had cracks, and that those cracks were used. Paper as a time machine. On the surface, the entries are cold. Marie L., formerly free woman of color, age 23, recorded henceforth as white by order of court. Infant male, mother listed as Celestine, colored. Father undisclosed. Complexion very fair. Registered as white per request of owner. Each line compresses an entire moral earthquake. Once the ink dried, the past was supposed to reorganize itself around that new fact. The children of Marie would grow up with a mother who was always white. The fair-skinned baby taken from Celestine's arms would be placed in a different household, perhaps in another parish, raised under a new name, told a different story of where he came from. The pieces that didn't fit, old neighbors who remembered, a midwife who had seen the birth, a cousin who knew too much, had to be quietly moved out of the frame. Sometimes that meant physical relocation. Sometimes it meant social death, never being invited, never being introduced, never being acknowledged as kin. Paper did not just record these transformations. It enforced them. When a person moved to a new city, it was the papers they carried, or that were sent ahead of them, that decided which door opened and which closed. A piece of parchment that said white could stand between its bearer and the auction block, between a first-class train car and the colored coach, between the front entrance and the back alley. The ledger is a kind of time machine because it shows the moment before the story hardened. It reveals that race, which later generations would treat as a self-evident fact, was once malleable enough to be adjusted by the right signature. Living in the shadow of the book, the clerk who misshelved the ledger did not know any of this. To him, it was just an old book that didn't match the label on the box. He likely moved on to the next task without a second thought. But for anyone who takes the time to read it closely, the ledger is the missing preface to thousands of modern lives. Each reclassified person left descendants who grew up believing a particular story about themselves. Maybe they were told their family had always been here as small farmers, or that their ancestors came from a certain European country and nothing more. Maybe, in some branches, a vague hint remained, an offhand comment about a darker ancestor, a warning not to ask too many questions about great-grandmother's parents. In others, the silence was complete. And somewhere else in the same country, the relatives who did not get reclassified lived under a very different script. Segregation, second-class citizenship, violence. Their descendants grew up knowing exactly where the law placed them, but not always knowing why cousins with the same eyes or cheekbones belonged to a world they could not enter. Without documents like this ledger, it would be easy to treat those two lines of descent as completely separate stories. With the ledger open on the table, that illusion cracks. The names that appear under reclassified do not erase the names that stayed in slave inventories and colored registers. They link to them silently across time. For historians, the existence of such a record is both a gift and a challenge. It proves in ink that race in that world was not simply seen and recorded, but managed and sometimes altered when it suited those in power. It invites suspicion toward every other document that takes racial categories for granted. If some people could be moved from black to white with a pen stroke, how many more had their true origins misfiled, misspelled, or deliberately erased? For descendants, The problem is more personal. The ledger raises questions no archive can fully answer. If your surname appears here, what exactly was traded so that you could be born into a life called White? Who was left behind on the other side of the line when the ink dried? What would it mean, now, to acknowledge those erased connections out loud? The book itself will not tell you. It offers only dates and decisions. The emotions are buried in the missing voices of the people whose fates it records. In one sense, the ledger did its job perfectly. It helped create a world in which generations could pass themselves off as simply white, without suspicion. But in another sense, it failed. By surviving, by not being burned, or lost in a flood, or eaten by insects, it left behind a paper trail that the future can follow. And in our own time, there is a new kind of ledger emerging, one the clerk who wrote those careful lines could never have imagined. The pattern of DNA inside millions of living bodies. Unlike ink, it cannot be edited with a pen. Unlike court orders, it does not obey local law. When people today spit into tubes and mail them to laboratories, the results often due to family myths, what this old book does to legal fictions. They reveal that the story of who is white and who is black in America has always been stranger, more entangled, and more haunted than almost anyone has been allowed to admit. This is where the narrative will eventually have to go. But before we arrive in the age of home DNA kits and online family trees, we need to walk through the other side of the ledger. The world of those who did not get reclassified, the families who stayed under the weight of the word colored, while their relatives slipped away into whiteness. Factories of disappearance don't look like factories at first. They look like ordinary buildings, a courthouse with peeling paint, a parish office smelling of candle wax and dust, a doctor's surgery with a brass plate on the door. Inside, there are no assembly lines, no chimneys, no machines. There are only desks, ink bottles, ledgers, and people who have learned how to turn a human life into a different kind of entry on a page. A signature here, a phrase crossed out there, a birth date shifted, a parent's name left blank, and just like that, a child who should have been counted among the colored slips, silently, into the column marked white. The ledger you met in the first chapter is not an anomaly. It is a clue to an entire ecosystem of institutions that help decide who could have their past rewritten and who would remain trapped in it. Each institution had its own logic, its own rituals, its own price. Together, they formed something more than the sum of their parts. A system that could erase ancestry when it was profitable or convenient, while insisting that race was fixed and sacred when it was not. The irony is brutal. The world that preached the rigidity of the color line also built hidden mechanisms to bend it for a chosen few. The courthouse, where race became paperwork. The first of these factories lived in plain sight, the county courthouse. On most days, its corridors echoed with the dull business of a segregated society. Clerks filed deeds that clearly labeled sellers and buyers by race. Judges sentenced black defendants more harshly than white ones for the same offenses. Marriage licenses were granted or denied based on the race of the applicants, as determined by local custom and the memories of older residents. In this environment, a petition to change a person's racial status did not appear as a moral earthquake. It appeared as a motion. A lawyer would draft a document using the formal, bloodless language of the law. Petitioner respectfully requests that this honorable court recognize that he is white in accordance with his true lineage. Evidence might be attached. Testimony from white neighbors, letters from employers, an affidavit from a midwife who now remembered the birth differently. A distant relative might swear that no black blood flowed in the family's veins, even if the family Bible told another story entirely. Sometimes, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the petition framed the change as a correction of an insult. A clerk, it was claimed, had misclassified a child at birth, or a rival had maliciously accused a family of African ancestry. The court, presented as neutral, had the opportunity to restore honor by certifying whiteness. The hearing might last an afternoon. The consequences would last generations. When a judge granted such a petition, the ruling did more than bless one individual. It sent a signal. Race was not a purely visible, self-evident fact. It could be negotiated for those with enough leverage, enough friends in the right places, or enough economic usefulness to the community. It could be amended, like a land deed whose boundaries needed tidying up. The courthouse file would contain the order, the supporting affidavits, maybe a newspaper clipping, if the case attracted attention. But the real work happened beyond those walls as the ruling filtered into other factories of disappearance: churches, schools, health offices, commercial networks. Religion offered another pathway. In many communities, the church book was as powerful as the civil record, sometimes more so. Baptismal registries recorded births, marriages, and deaths long before official state systems caught up. A note in the margin, colored, mulatto, free person of color, could shape a person's status more effectively than any rumor. That meant a priest or minister could deliberately or passively participate in reclassification. A family seeking to pass might approach a sympathetic clergyman with a request couched in emotional terms. Perhaps the mother was desperate that her child not be marked in a way that would cause suffering. Perhaps the father, if white, appeared in person, pressing the weight of his social standing onto the decision. The clergyman might convince himself that he was acting in mercy, sparing the child from a life of prejudice. Or he might simply see which way the local winds were blowing and adjust accordingly. A stroke of the pen could omit the racial label. A replacement certificate could be issued with subtle changes. A mother's name slightly altered, a notation quietly dropped, a foreign birthplace inserted to muddy the waters. In communities with complex mixtures, Creoles, immigrants, free people of color, these ambiguities could be exploited. Once baptized as white, a child had a foothold. Later institutions, like schools or marriage courts, often relied on church records as proof. The religious register thus acted as both a spiritual and administrative factory. It created souls in the eyes of the church and identities in the eyes of the state. As the 20th century approached, another kind of record grew in importance: the birth certificate. Earlier generations had depended on family Bibles, church books, and hearsay. Now, slowly, states began standardizing birth registration. The doctor or midwife who attended a birth, or the hospital that delivered the baby, was responsible for filling out a form and sending it to a central office. Those forms had boxes. One of them said race. At first glance, this seems like a move toward clarity. In reality, it opened a new space for manipulation. The person filling out the form was often relying on quick visual judgment, the word of relatives, or local assumptions about the parents. If a father insisted the child was white and carried himself as a white man, many physicians did not look deeper. Marking white cost them nothing. Marking colored might cost them socially. Midwives, especially black midwives, occupied a more dangerous position. Many knew exactly which households were hiding racial secrets. They had delivered children in the quarters and in the big house. They had seen white men appear in black cabins late at night, and white wives pretend not to notice. Their knowledge posed a threat to the fictions the community wanted to maintain. Some midwives chose loyalty to their own communities, recording births honestly even when pressured. Others, under threat of losing their livelihoods or facing legal action, learned when to keep their pens still. A few, perhaps, saw an opportunity to help a child escape the fate they themselves had suffered, and quietly marked white when the baby's skin allowed for plausible deniability. Each of these choices turned the medical office into another factory of disappearance. The certificate once filed became a foundational document. Future clerks, judges, and employers would take it as proof without considering how subjective that original tick in the race box had been. Around these official sites whirled a constellation of smaller brokers, notaries, lawyers, real estate agents, and businessmen who understood the currency of whiteness. Property laws and business rules often made race a financial variable. Only white people could own certain kinds of land, run particular businesses, or access specific lines of credit. Insurance companies evaluated risk partly based on race. Employers slotted workers into jobs with different pay scales and protections depending on how they were categorized. In such an environment, the ability to tweak someone's official race became an economic service. A lawyer might draft a will that carefully avoided mentioning a beneficiary's color, then argue in probate court that the deceased had treated that person as kin and therefore intended them to be recognized as white. A notary might quietly witness a document asserting no known Negro ancestry without asking too many questions. A real estate agent might encourage a family with ambiguous background to move into a white neighborhood, vouching for them to suspicious neighbors in exchange for a commission. These were not official policies. They were workarounds and personal deals. But multiplied across a society, they formed a shadow system, unwritten rules by which those close to whiteness could sometimes buy their way in further. The price was always the same in principle, even if it differed in detail. Money, favors, silence, and distance from people who could contradict the new story. It is tempting to imagine that all of this happened only in cities, where paperwork flowed and institutions grew thick on the ground. But plantations had their own, cruder factories of disappearance. There, the process was often physical before it was documentary. A white passing baby born to an enslaved or mixed-race woman could be taken away and raised in another household, perhaps in town, perhaps in another state. A distant cousin might adopt the child informally, presenting them to the world as an orphaned relative from elsewhere. In these cases, the first paperwork might be a simple entry in a slave inventory. Female infant, very fair, child of Celestine. Later, once the child had been moved, a new document might appear. Jane, age 3, orphan, taken into the household of. The link between the two was kept in the memories of a handful of adults and in the body of the child, which gradually grew into its new assigned role. Plantation owners and overseers did not always bother with formal reclassification. They understood that distance could do the work of law. Once removed from the community that knew her origins, a light-skinned girl could grow up as white with minimal risk, provided she never encountered the people who had seen her birth. Urban networks, by contrast, leaned on the anonymity of cities. A family that moved from the countryside to a neighborhood where no one knew their grandparents could present themselves as whatever the papers said they were. If those papers were sparse or contradictory, all the better. Ambiguity was a resource. In both settings, disappearance was a process, a series of small separations, geographical, social, and bureaucratic, that gradually severed a person from any documented black ancestry. Who was shut out? For every person who successfully navigated this maze, thousands could not. Dark skin closed doors instantly. Poverty made bribery impossible. Lack of connections meant petitions gathered dust or were laughed out of court. A midwife's honest entry on a certificate could not be easily undone if the family had no lawyer to argue otherwise. Enslaved people had essentially no access to these factories unless an owner chose to use them for his own reasons. Free black communities sometimes produced individuals who could have passed, but doing so meant cutting ties with their neighbors, churches, and mutual aid networks, the very things that gave their lives structure and meaning. Moreover, the system had built-in safeguards to protect itself from being overwhelmed by its own flexibility. Whenever too many rumors circulated about people slipping through, white supremacist politicians would tighten the laws. They would re-emphasize the one-drop rule, increase penalties for miscegenation, and publish outraged editorials about race fraud. These spasms of anxiety were backhanded acknowledgments that the factories of disappearance were real and that they threatened the purity myth whiteness depended on. In a twisted way, this tension reveals the central paradox. Whiteness presented itself as natural and self-evident, yet it constantly needed paperwork, testimony, and state violence to keep its boundaries intact. The human cost inside the machines. From the outside, the factories of disappearance look like systems. From the inside, they were experiences lived by terrified, hopeful, conflicted human beings. In the courthouse, a young man might stand in his best suit, sweating through his collar, as lawyers debated whether he was really white. In the parish office, a mother might grip the edge of a desk and beg a priest to spare her child from the mark that had scarred her life. In a doctor's room, a midwife might hesitate over a form, torn between truth and the chance to give a newborn a different future. For those who succeeded, the relief was enormous, but not simple. They walked out of these places carrying a wound the law could not see. The knowledge that their safety depended on forgetting who else in their family did not have access to the same doors. For those denied reclassification, the message was clear. The factories did not exist for them. The state that claimed to be blind to color when it was convenient suddenly saw too clearly when they approached. And for the descendants, a century later, the legacy is confusion. A DNA test might reveal unexpected ancestry. A scanned document might show that a great-grandparent petitioned to be declared white or was refused. Urban legends in the family about Indian blood or Spanish grandmothers may, under the light of evidence, turn out to be rerouted stories about black ancestors who were not meant to be spoken of. The factories of disappearance did their best to grind these truths into dust. Yet enough fragments remain, in ledgers, court files, parish books, and now in the code written into people's bodies, that the machines can be reconstructed. In the next chapter, the focus turns from institutions to individuals. the families who tried to live inside the identities these factories created, the moments when the machinery failed, and the public scandals that forced courts and communities to confront the instability of whiteness itself. In the summer of 1910, a judge in a cramped Southern courtroom was asked to decide something no pair of human eyes could actually see: the color of a woman's blood. There she stood in her best dress, skin as pale as the clerk's, hair pinned neatly, English flawless, and yet the entire trial turned on a rumor whispered generations earlier about a black ancestor nobody could prove existed. Her neighbors testified to her kindness, her church attendance, her ladylike demeanor. The opposing side brought out plantation ledgers and a yellowed bill of sale. The question was absurd and lethal at the same time. Was she white enough to inherit, to marry, to stay? Or had an invisible drop of ancestry turned her into legal property in retrospect? One verdict, and the future of her children, her name, her very category as a human being, would be rewritten with a stroke of a pen. They called them passing cases in the newspapers, as if the entire problem could be reduced to a moral riddle. What happens when a person born into blackness crosses the line and lives as white? On paper, the answer was supposed to be simple. States had defined race in increasingly rigid terms. One drop of African ancestry could make a person colored, no matter how light their skin or how far back that ancestor lived. In practice, the system was both fragile and vicious. It depended on gossip, memory, and paperwork that could be altered or vanished. The law claimed to be about blood. What it really measured was power, a family that vanished twice. Imagine a family that appears in the archives under two different names. In one set of documents, they are listed as mulatto or colored, taxed differently, restricted in where they can live, barred from certain schools and jobs. A generation later, some of the same first names show up again, but now in a different county, with slightly changed surnames, recorded as white, owning property, voting, sending children to whites-only schools. To an archivist, it looks like two unrelated families. To their descendants, 100 years later, it becomes a revelation. Their lineage doubled back on itself. One branch stayed visibly black. Another stepped across the line and disappeared into whiteness. The transition rarely happened cleanly. It began with small acts of paper violence, a midwife omitting a racial note on a birth certificate, a clerk forgetting the word colored, a priest recording a marriage without mentioning ancestry, a railroad conductor choosing not to question a light-skinned passenger's ticket. None of these people had the power to change the law, but each of them had the power to look away. The families who passed understood the stakes. If no one challenged their whiteness in public, if no angry neighbor or jealous coworker or suspicious official decided to dig, the law would let them stand where they had placed themselves. Race, in that moment, stopped being a biological destiny and became something far more cruel, a test of how well you could disappear. For every family that slipped across, there were others who tried and failed. Newspapers loved these stories. They turned them into morality plays about deception. A teacher fired when her ancestry was exposed. A bride annulled when a relative arrived from another state with an old family Bible. A businessman sued when a rival uncovered evidence that his grandmother had been enslaved. In the headlines, the lesson was clear. The system will find you out. But the reality was uglier and more arbitrary. Exposure often came not from careful investigation, but from vengeance, jealousy, or control. Someone got hurt, someone got angry, and race became a weapon of retaliation. The consequences were devastating. A person who had lived as white could lose everything in a single week: job, home, marriage, legal status. For their children, the blow was worse. A son who had worn the Confederate gray in commemorations or served in the U.S. military as a white man might suddenly find himself barred from the very institutions he had fought to defend. A daughter raised to expect a certain future could be reclassified overnight and pushed into segregated schools or denied inheritance. The law did not see this as cruelty, it saw it as correction. If records showed colored ancestry somewhere in the past, then the present had to be forced into alignment, no matter how much life had been built in the meantime. The past, in other words, could be weaponized against the present at any moment. The quiet conspiracies inside families, inside households, the tension was constant. To pass successfully, a family had to do more than change documents. They had to police themselves. Stories were edited. Photographs disappeared. Old relatives were quietly dropped from family gatherings or described as servants instead of kin. Children were taught what not to ask. One of the most painful acts was the deliberate rupture with siblings or cousins who could not pass. Sometimes the difference was something as arbitrary as a shade of skin, a curl of hair, or the shape of a nose. One child might be deemed safe to present as white. Another, born from the same parents, might be judged too visibly black to make the crossing. The decision wasn't always written down, but it was lived. One moved north, took a new surname, and married into whiteness. The other stayed behind, carrying the label the law had given them. The result was a form of internal exile, enforced by love, twisted into fear. A passing relative might send money back quietly, or letters with no return address, or gifts through intermediaries. But they could not risk being publicly photographed together, could not acknowledge each other in spaces where a neighbor might ask, "How exactly are you related?" The line between survival and betrayal blurred until it became impossible to separate. When whiteness became a burden, passing promised safety, but it came with its own prison. To maintain the illusion, a person had to live with constant vigilance. Any slip, a careless remark about a childhood neighborhood, an unexplained visit to a black church, a relative showing up unannounced, could become evidence. Friendships stayed shallow. Holidays were complicated. Neighborhoods had to be chosen carefully, preferably places where nobody knew anyone's grandparents. And then there was the fear of children. A baby born with darker skin than expected could shatter everything. Parents who had crossed into whiteness sometimes found themselves staring at their own infant with a dread their ancestors had known from the other side. What will the world do to this child because of what it thinks it sees? In a bitter twist, the same genetic roulette that had once produced white-passing babies on plantations now threatened to expose white-presenting families in cities and suburbs. For some, the burden became too great. A few chose to reveal their ancestry voluntarily, confessing to spouses, telling older children, trying to reconnect with relatives who had been cut off. This kind of reverse crossing brought its own pain. Spouses felt deceived. Children felt their identity yanked out from under them. White friends drifted away. But for the people who chose it, the confession offered something passing could never give: the chance to live without the constant dread of being unmasked. When these private dramas exploded into public view, they often did so in courtrooms. Judges were suddenly forced to answer questions the law itself could not handle cleanly. If a person had lived as white for 20 years, married as white, paid taxes as white, and been accepted by their community as white, what did it mean to strip that away because of a birth record 2 generations back? Was race a matter of legal paperwork, social consensus, or biological ancestry? Most courts chose the most rigid answer. 1 drop was enough. Yet the very need for trials exposed how unstable that rule was. If race truly were obvious and self-evident, there would have been no need for witnesses to debate skin tone under harsh courtroom light, no need for genealogists to trace names through smudged ledgers, no need for lawyers to argue over the meaning of a grandmother's surname. Every such case was, in its own way, an admission that the system could not reliably see what it claimed to govern. For the families on trial, the experience was a kind of public vivisection. Their private history, who married whom, who had which child with whom, who moved away and why, was dragged into official transcripts. Their bodies were measured and described in cold language. Their relationships were reduced to exhibits. Once the verdict was spoken, the world outside adjusted with brutal speed. Employers fired. Landlords evicted. Churches quietly suggested that membership might be reconsidered. The state did not have to enforce every consequence directly. It only had to signal that a person belonged on one side of the color line, and society did the rest. While one branch of a family tried to hold their place inside whiteness, the branch that remained openly black carried an entirely different cost. They were the ones who lived under Jim Crow without disguise, denied the vote, beaten for minor infractions, terrorized by lynching and police violence. They watched cousins or siblings vanish north or go west under new names, and they understood the temptation. But they also carried a bitter knowledge. Every person who passed reduced the numbers of those fighting the system openly. In black communities, stories about passing relatives carried a complicated tone: anger, envy, resignation, sometimes a quiet pride that our people had outsmarted the enemy, even at a terrible price. A grandmother might speak of a brother or sister who married out and never came back. A great-uncle might hint at white kinfolk who don't know their kin. The details blurred over time. The ache did not. And so, generation after generation, the same question echoed: is it better to survive inside a lie or suffer openly inside the truth? There was never a single answer. Only choices made under pressure most people today can barely imagine. By the mid-20th century, the system that had enforced these choices began to crack. War, migration, urbanization, and the civil rights movement all worked together to destabilize the rigid local knowledge that passing had depended on. People moved farther from the places that knew their grandparents. Cities grew. Neighborhoods changed, records were lost in fires and floods, or simply misfiled in basements. At the same time, science quietly prepared a new kind of reckoning. The more biologists learned about genetics, the clearer it became that race, as the law had framed it, had no neat biological foundation. The one-drop rule was exposed as what it had always been: a political decision dressed up as natural order. The families who had passed into whiteness found themselves in an ambiguous position. Legally, they were safe. Socially, they were at home. But the moral and historical questions they had dodged did not vanish. They waited. They waited in sealed envelopes in county courthouses. They waited in marginal notes on birth certificates. They waited in faded Bibles kept in trunks. They waited in stories half told at kitchen tables, and then cut short with the phrase, "We don't talk about that." They waited most of all in the DNA of their descendants. And that is where the next chapter of this story begins. Not in a courtroom, but in a cheap plastic test kit ordered online, when a person who has always been told, "You're just white," opens a results page and sees a percentage they cannot explain, and a list of genetic matches with surnames they do not recognize. The system that once used blood to erase people is about to be confronted by blood that remembers. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day when nothing important is supposed to happen. A woman in her 40s clicked open her DNA results on her phone while standing in line for coffee, expecting the digital equivalent of beige wallpaper. Mostly British and Irish, maybe some German. What appeared instead felt like a glitch, a percentage of West African ancestry she could not explain. Dozens of genetic matches with surnames she had never heard before, many of them clustered in a southern state her family insisted they had never lived in. At the bottom of the screen, a message invited her to connect with your cousins. She stared at the names, at faces in tiny profile pictures that looked unmistakably like her own. The story she had been told about who she was had just been outvoted by her own blood. In the centuries when race was enforced with whips and legal codes, ancestry moved in one direction, from the past into the present, pushed forward by memory and paper. Elders told stories, Bibles held names, ledgers recorded who belonged to whom. If someone wanted to erase a lineage, they could burn a book, hide a document, silence a witness, sell a child. Today, for the first time, ancestry also flows in the opposite direction. The present can interrogate the past with a tool no slave owner, judge, or clerk ever anticipated. The sequences hidden in living people's cells. Cheap DNA tests were not designed to expose historical crimes. They were marketed as entertainment, curiosity in a box. But once millions of people sent their saliva to laboratories, those labs built something much more dangerous to old lies. Databases that could show how closely strangers are related and what broad regions their forebears likely came from. The factories of disappearance you saw in earlier chapters were built on the assumption that paperwork, distance, and silence would hold. None of them planned for the day when a descendant could, by clicking a link, assemble a map of genetic cousins whose very existence contradicts the official story. For many test takers, the results confirm what they already know. A mix of European ancestries, perhaps some indigenous roots long spoken of in the family, or African lineage proudly claimed. But for others, the results introduce dissonance. A man who has always believed himself entirely white discovers a segment of African ancestry large enough to suggest a fairly recent black ancestor. A woman who grew up in a black family, taught that their skin tone came from a rumored Native American great-grandparent, learns that the test shows no indigenous ancestry at all, but a significant percentage of European DNA instead. These numbers are not court verdicts or perfect maps of origin. They are estimates, rounded and recalculated as databases grow. Yet they are specific enough to challenge family myths. They raise questions that old ledgers and censuses cannot easily hide from. The shock does not come only from percentages. It comes from lists of people. Most consumer DNA services show matches, other users whose DNA overlaps significantly with yours. A close match means a close relative. More distant matches point to shared great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents. Suddenly, the abstract idea that we are all connected turns into a concrete list of names, faces, and locations. A white-presenting person in the Midwest might see that many of their closest unknown matches are black families from a single Louisiana parish. A black family in that parish might notice that a cluster of their matches lives in Boston and appears in photos as white. If both sides reach out, the long severed branches of a tree begin, awkwardly, to see each other again. For descendants of those who passed into whiteness, DNA can feel like the return of suppressed history, arriving not as accusation but as data. They may discover through online trees and message threads that a great-grandparent's vague story about being from down south masks something far more specific. A black great-great-grandmother recorded as an enslaved woman in one set of records, and that same woman's children listed as white in another state's documents a decade later. For the descendants of those who did not pass, DNA offers something just as powerful: proof that the relatives who vanished into whiteness were real, and that their bloodlines did not simply dissolve. The ledgers that once refused to connect names across racial categories are contradicted by a simple laboratory report showing that the so-called white Johnsons and the colored Johnsons share enough DNA to be second cousins. In the stories shared on genealogy forums, you can see the emotional choreography: repeat, surprise, sometimes disbelief. There has to be a mistake. Quiet checking of old conversations with parents and grandparents. Sudden reinterpretation of vague hints. We had some French from Louisiana. Your great-grandma was very light. We don't talk about that side. Anger at being lied to, or at least not fully told the truth. And then in some cases, a decision: to dig deeper or to close the laptop and try to forget. DNA gives the ghosts names, locations, and shared segments of chromosome. But it cannot force anyone to open their door. The new color line. Who answers the message? Technology can show that two people are related. It cannot dictate how they will react. Some people embrace the discovery. A white man who learns he has black cousins may travel to meet them, attend family reunions in neighborhoods his parents would never have entered, listen to stories that reframe his entire understanding of American history. A black woman who finds out that a line of her family passed into whiteness might feel a strange, bitter pride that her ancestors were clever enough to manipulate a system rigged against them, even as she mourns the relationships that were sacrificed. Others respond with denial or retreat. A newly discovered cousin might refuse contact, arguing that DNA is just science and that race doesn't matter anymore, while also making it clear that they do not wish to publicly acknowledge relatives who would complicate their appearance of whiteness. Another might worry, sometimes with reason, about the social or professional consequences of being associated with a family history that contradicts the image they have built. In online discussions, people describe relatives who quietly redo tests with different companies, hoping for a different result, or who refuse to talk about the matches that contradict the official narrative. The old instinct to protect passing at all costs has not disappeared. It has simply moved into a new medium. The difference now is that secrecy is harder to maintain. The information does not live only in one family's Bible or one county's courthouse. It lives in cloud servers spread across millions of users' accounts. Deleting your own results does not erase the shared segments of DNA that other relatives still carry and see. Justice, curiosity, and the weight of knowledge. For some descendants of the left-behind lines, the revelation is double-edged. On the one hand, it validates long-held suspicions and lore. The older relative who always insisted, "We had kin who went north and started calling themselves white," is vindicated. The names in the ledger from Chapter 1 become more than ink. They become specific profiles with hobbies, families, and social media pages. On the other hand, DNA offers no legal compensation and little formal justice. There is no court where you can ask to be reimbursed for generations of opportunities denied, while your cousins prospered on the other side of the color line. No governmental body will adjust your family's past wages or land ownership because an algorithm confirms that your great-grandparents were siblings. What DNA offers instead is a different kind of reckoning. It demands that people decide what to do with the knowledge that their identities sit atop layers of historical choices, coerced and otherwise. For the descendants of those who passed, it asks, will you continue the silence, or will you teach your children the fuller story of where they come from? For the descendants of those who stayed, it asks, is there room in your understanding of family to include people whose ancestors escaped at your grandparents' expense? These are not abstractions. They are decisions about who gets invited to weddings, who appears in framed photos, whose stories are told at holidays. History in the living room. In many households, the biggest impact of DNA is not the dramatic reveal, but the quiet, uncomfortable conversation at the dinner table. A teenager excitedly shows a parent that their results list a half-uncle the parent has never mentioned. A grandmother, confronted with a high percentage of European ancestry, finally tells the story she swore she'd take to her grave about a white man in the family line, whom everyone was forbidden to name. An elderly white relative fumes that those websites are nonsense when confronted with African ancestry, revealing prejudices they had long kept coded. Sometimes these conversations lead to deeper understanding, even healing. A family might collectively embrace the complexity of their background, using it as a way to talk about slavery, segregation, and migration, without treating those topics as distant history. They might visit archives together, searching for documents that match the DNA hints, piecing together the real story that was splintered on purpose. Other times, the pressure is too much. People close accounts, forbid further discussion, insist that what matters is how we live now. In doing so, they echo, consciously or not, the logic of the old factories of disappearance, that it is safer not to know. What DNA ultimately destroys is the illusion that passing, reclassification, and racial secrecy were marginal phenomena. The sheer number of people encountering unexpected ancestry suggests that these practices were widespread enough to leave a mark across entire populations. The ledger from Chapter 1 recorded only those whose transformation was officially blessed. The factories of disappearance processed only a fraction of the people with mixed ancestry. But genes do not respect file boundaries. They carry forward every union, every assault, every secret relationship, regardless of whether a clerk decided to write it down. As a result, the story of America's color lines is now being rewritten from both ends. Historians digging through fragile paper, and ordinary people reading reports on their phones. The two streams meet in living rooms and message threads, in awkward introductions, at family reunions, where someone says, "We just found out last year." If the men who designed and defended the racial laws of the past could see the present, they might be horrified. Not only that their categories are being questioned, but that their careful efforts to control who could cross the line have been punctured by a technology they could not imagine. Enslaved mothers whose white-passing babies were taken from them could never have guessed that, a century and a half later, their descendants might find each other again through bar-coded plastic tubes and laboratory machines. Slave owners who used ledgers to turn children into assets could not foresee that some of those children's heirs would use different ledgers, digital ones, to reclaim a connection across time. Of course, DNA cannot speak intentions. It cannot tell you whether an ancestor chose to pass as an act of survival or out of contempt for those they left behind. It cannot distinguish between love and violence in the coupling that produced a given child. It does not moralize. It simply insists you are related. The ethics are for the living. In the end, DNA is not a verdict handed down from on high. It is an invitation. It places each person who receives unexpected results in a position eerily similar to that of a judge in an old passing case, but with a crucial difference. Those judges decided whether someone would be legally white or black, often in ways that advanced their own interests or upheld a cruel order. Today, there is no law compelling you to accept or deny what the test says. There is only the mirror of your own conscience. You can choose to treat the uncomfortable parts as errors and close the tab. You can choose to cherry-pick the pieces that flatter you and ignore the rest. Or you can do what earlier generations were forbidden to do. Follow the trail, learn the names, acknowledge the full spread of your kin, and tell the story forward rather than hiding it. The factories of disappearance were built to make sure certain truths never reach the future. Yet here they are, arriving anyway, encoded not only in bytes and paper, but in the living fabric of bodies walking around right now. For centuries, power decided who was allowed to belong to which category, who could cross lines, who had to stay behind them, and whose children were quietly reassigned to another world. Now the categories themselves are cracking under the weight of evidence. The question the past throws at the present is no longer, "What are you?" in the narrow sense, but "What will you do with what you now know?" Because once the dead have spoken through your blood, the only remaining act of disappearance is chosen, not imposed. The decision to look away,